Hi there, and welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins in the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, where every whisper carries further than it should, and every secret is stitched neatly beneath a smile. Well, local seamstress is found dead, her final work left unfinished. No one can explain the strange red thread clutched in her hand. To the police, it's a tragedy. To Miss Marple, it's a pattern waiting to be seen. As she unravels the truth stitch by stitch, she finds that in this quiet village, even kindness can hide a knot of deceit. Stay with us till the end. And if you love mysteries where the smallest detail unravels everything, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Seamstress Who Vanished. The morning it began was one of those rare, quiet Sundays when St. Mary Mead seemed to breathe in harmony with itself. The sun rose gently over the hedgerows, spreading a pale light across the cobbled lanes and tidy gardens. The air was cool and smelled faintly of lilacs and baking bread. Church bells chimed in the distance, calling the faithful. Housewives aired their linens. Cats stretched in doorways. Everything, as usual, was perfectly ordinary, except for one thing. At the far end of High Street stood Mrs. Agnes Webb's sewing shop, a small, neatly kept place with a green door and a bell that jingled whenever a customer entered. For 20 years, Agnes had been the village's quiet miracle worker. She could mend a torn hem so neatly that the tear seemed never to have existed. She remembered every customer's preferences, never overcharged, and always had a kind word to spare. In a village where gossip ran thicker than cream, Agnes Webb was oddly untouched by it. People trusted her. She belonged to everyone and to no one. But that Sunday morning, her shop did not open. By 8:30, the milkman noticed the shutters were still drawn. By 9, Mrs. Bantry from the greengrocer's paused outside and frowned. By 9:30, half the high street knew that Mrs. Webb was late, and by 10, they were sure something was wrong. Her curtains were half open, her light was off, and her sewing table, usually cluttered with pins and half-finished dresses, sat strangely clean. Mrs. Bantry was the first to knock. "Agnes," she called softly. No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. Curiosity turned to unease. Through the lace curtain, she peered inside. Everything was perfectly arranged, scissors on their stand, threads in color order, the sewing machine covered neatly. But one thing caught her eye, a single spool of red thread unspooling across the counter, leading down to the floor and out of sight toward the back door. Mrs. Bantry's stomach tightened. Agnes Webb was tidy to the point of obsession. She would never leave a spool trailing. Within an hour, the village constable had been summoned. Constable Jenkins, a young man with more enthusiasm than experience. He arrived on his bicycle, red-faced and out of breath, notebook in hand. He tried the front door. It was locked from the inside. He went around to the back, found the garden gate unlatched, and pushed gently on the rear door. It creaked open without resistance. Inside, the sewing shop smelled faintly of lavender and starch. Everything was in order, except for the red thread that snaked along the floor, curling under tables and chairs as though it had a mind of its own. Jenkins followed it carefully, his boots clicking on the wood. The thread led to the center of the room, and then vanished under the rug. When he lifted the rug, he found nothing beneath it but bare floorboards, and a small stain of something dark and rust-colored near the edge. He stood very still. Then, as though remembering his training, he scribbled something in his notebook, cleared his throat, and left to fetch help. By midday, word had spread. The villagers gathered in clusters outside the shop, whispering. Someone swore they'd seen a man near the shop the night before, tall, wearing a brown coat. Someone else insisted Agnes had mentioned receiving a strange letter on Saturday. Theories multiplied tangled like threads in a basket. And through it all, Miss Marple listened. She stood near the edge of the crowd, a small, neat figure in a pale blue dress and straw hat, holding a basket of cut flowers. Her eyes, bright, shrewd, endlessly observant, moved quietly from one speaker to the next. She asked no questions. She didn't need to. She was already forming them in her mind. It wasn't until the constable emerged again that the whispers hushed. "She's not there," he said awkwardly. "House is locked. No sign of struggle. Back door open. Could be she went out early." Mrs. Bantry folded her arms. Without her handbag? Without her hat? That woman never stepped outside without her hat, Jenkins. The constable reddened. We'll have a look about." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "You say the back door was open, Constable? Was the key in the lock?" Jenkins blinked. Yes, ma'am. On the inside." "How very peculiar," Miss Marple said softly. "One does not usually lock oneself out and in at the same time." He frowned, uncertain whether to agree. She smiled faintly. "No doubt it will all come clear." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the shop herself. She was not one to intrude on police matters, but she had been asked to bring Mrs. Webb's spare key to Jenkins, who was now poking about rather aimlessly inside. The constable looked grateful to see her. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Strange business, this." "Yes," she murmured, stepping just inside the doorway. "Quite strange indeed." Her eyes swept over the little shop. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting thin bars of gold across the counter. Everything smelled faintly of pressed linen and dust. And then she saw it, the red thread again. It ran across the counter, dipped to the floor, and ended abruptly where Jenkins had lifted the rug. "Such a bright color," Miss Marple said gently. "Not her usual shade, I think." The constable looked puzzled. "How'd you mean?" "Mrs. Webb preferred neutral threads for mending," she said. "White gray beige. But this," she lifted the spool lightly between gloved fingers. "This looks new. Imported, perhaps. I can't recall seeing her use it before." Jenkins scribbled it down dutifully. "Could have been an order for someone." "Possibly," Miss Marple said, setting it back down. "Though if it were, she would have written the customer's name on a tag, as she always did." The constable didn't reply. Miss Marple's gaze moved toward the small table by the window. A half-finished dress lay folded there, simple, gray cotton. A pin still held a seam together, halfway stitched. But the needle that should have been threaded was bare. "She left her work unfinished," Miss Marple murmured. "That's unlike her." Jenkins nodded, flipping through his notebook. "We'll send word to her sister in Bath. See if she's gone visiting." "Yes," Miss Marple said absently, still studying the room. "Do that." She knelt, peering more closely at the floor near the rug. The faint stain Jenkins had noticed was there, small, circular, and oddly dark against the wood. Not much. Not enough for alarm, but enough to make her thoughtful. Then something else caught her attention, a tiny glint near the skirting board. She leaned forward and plucked it up delicately. A broken sewing needle, snapped clean in half. "Constable," she said quietly, holding it out to him, "have you ever known Mrs. Webb to break her needles?" He frowned. "Can't say I have." "No," Miss Marple said softly, "nor have I." She placed the pieces carefully on the counter, brushed her hands, and looked around one last time. The shop felt frozen, not abandoned, but paused, like a photograph of life interrupted mid-motion. The clock on the wall had stopped at 7 minutes past 6. The kettle on the stove was empty. The chair by the sewing table was slightly pushed back, as if someone had just stood up. Miss Marple's eyes rested once more on the red thread. It trailed across the floor like a vein, bright, deliberate, leading somewhere unseen. Her fingers twitched slightly, as though resisting the urge to follow it. Instead, she turned to Jenkins. "Do let me know if her sister has heard from her." Of course, Miss Marple. She smiled kindly, stepped out into the sunlight, and walked slowly down the lane toward her cottage. To anyone watching, she looked as serene as ever, the picture of a harmless old lady with a basket of flowers. But behind her calm eyes, thoughts moved like gears in a clock. A tidy shop left unlocked. A missing woman with no reason to run. A thread cut short, or perhaps not cut at all. And in the quiet of her mind, Miss Marple knew one thing already. Something wicked had slipped its way into St. Mary Mead, and it had left its trace in red. Chapter 2. The Thread of Lies. The following morning brought rain, a slow, steady drizzle that settled over St. Mary Mead like a sigh. Gray clouds gathered above the thatched roofs, and the lanes turned slick with puddles. To most, it was a dull and forgettable Monday. But to Miss Marple, it was the kind of day when the world seemed to whisper secrets, if one only listened carefully enough. She sat by her sitting room window, teacup in hand, watching the rain trickle down the glass. The newspaper lay folded beside her, untouched. She wasn't reading. She was remembering. The red thread, the broken needle. The clock stopped at 7 minutes past 6. Each small detail tugged at her mind like a loose stitch waiting to unravel. Mrs. Webb was a creature of habit, one of the most orderly souls in St. Mary Mead. For her to leave her shop unlocked, her kettle cold, and her work half finished, no, it wasn't chance. Something had interrupted her, suddenly and decisively. At 9:30, a knock sounded at her door. It was Inspector Graves, a tall man with kind eyes and a faint air of weariness. He'd come from Much Benham to take charge of the case. Miss Marple knew him slightly. He had once investigated the unfortunate business of the vicar's missing silver. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside and removing his hat. "I thought I'd best come by before the whole village starts inventing ghosts." She smiled mildly. "They've already begun, Inspector. St. Mary Mead can spin a mystery faster than a spider spins silk." Graves gave a tired chuckle. "So I've noticed. We've searched the shop again. Nothing missing. No signs of a struggle. And no trace of Mrs. Webb. Have you checked the river?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "We have. And we've wired Bath. Her sister hasn't heard a word." Miss Marple nodded, thoughtful. "And the red thread?" The inspector raised an eyebrow. "Ah, yes. Jenkins mentioned that. You think it's important?" "I think," she said softly, "that people reveal more than they intend by the smallest of things. A thread, a habit, a look across a room. Life is full of clues, Inspector. The trouble is, most people never learn to see them. Gravis maid fantly. And you do." "Oh, I don't know about that," she said, pouring him a cup of tea. "But I've been alive a very long time, and one does notice patterns. You see, people are rather like sewing. Pull one stitch, and the whole seam comes undone." He accepted the tea, his curiosity quietly piqued. "So what pattern do you see here?" Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the window. Rain slid down like beads on glass. A woman who disappears without a trace rarely does so by accident. Either she had reason to run, which Agnes Webb most certainly did not, or someone ensured she could not be found. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way through the drizzle to pay a call on Mrs. Finch, who lived above the post office and claimed to have seen something most peculiar the night before the disappearance. Mrs. Finch was a plump, nervous woman who delighted in secrets, but rarely had real ones to tell. Her sitting room smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wallpaper. "I tell you, Miss Marple," she said, leaning forward eagerly, "I heard voices, late on Saturday night, from the alley behind the sewing shop. A man's voice and hers. I couldn't make out the words, but she sounded upset, terribly upset." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And you're quite certain it was Mrs. Webb?" "Oh, yes, I know her voice anywhere. Always so polite, even when she was cross." and then there was a sound like something falling. A thump, then silence. What time was this, Mrs. Finch? Oh, around 6 or 7, I'd say, just after I'd finished my washing. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The clock in the sewing shop had stopped at 7 minutes past 6. Did you see the man? No, dear, I didn't. Only heard the voice. Deep, rough sort of tone. Could have been from out of town. You know how you can tell. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. And you mentioned a thump, but not a cry. Mrs. Finch shook her head. No cry. Just that one sound, and then nothing. Miss Marple thanked her gently, accepted a soggy biscuit she didn't want, and stepped back into the rain. The village lane gleamed like glass beneath the gray sky. Somewhere the dog barked. She paused for a moment, looking back toward the shop. The alley behind it was narrow, overgrown with ivy, and half hidden from the road. If someone had followed Agnes there, it would have been the perfect place. But who? And why? By evening, Miss Marple had a visitor of her own. It was Lydia Reeves, one of Agnes Webb's regular customers. A young woman of perhaps 30, fashionable and sharp-eyed, dressed in a raincoat that looked far too fine for village life. She carried herself with the nervous grace of someone hiding a secret. Miss Marple, she said quickly, as soon as she was shown in, I didn't want to go to the police. They'd think it unkind, but I must tell someone. Agnes and I had words the day before she vanished. Miss Marple gestured for her to sit. Go on, my dear. Lydia hesitated. I'd brought her a dress to alter, a gift from a friend. She asked too many questions. She said the fabric was expensive, not the sort one buys on a shopgirl's wages. She hinted things. I told her it wasn't her business. I see, Miss Marple said softly. And did she seem afraid? Afraid? No, just stern, like she'd seen something she didn't approve of. And you left it at that? Lydia bit her lip. She said something odd as I left. She said, be careful what you sew into your life, Miss Reeves. Some seams can't be undone. Miss Marple leaned back, thoughtful. And what did you take that to mean? I thought she was being moralistic. She could be, you know. But now I don't know. Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. Thank you, my dear. You've done the right thing by telling me. When Lydia left, the room fell into silence once more. Outside, the rain had stopped. The wind stirred the curtains softly. Miss Marple sat still for a long time, eyes unfocused, mind working like a clock mechanism ticking toward an answer. A quarrel at 6, a broken needle, a red thread that did not belong, a dress that came from someone who could afford far better. She rose, reached for her cardigan, and stepped out into the damp night. The streets of St. Mary Mead were dark and glistening. Lantern light shone through windows. Far down the lane, the sewing shop stood shuttered and silent. She paused outside it, staring at the faint glint of red still visible through the glass. Then she moved toward the side alley, narrow, cold, and lined with dripping ivy. The air smelled of wet earth and metal. She bent low, brushing her hand along the ground. There, a faint scrape like a dragged heel. And something else, a small button, pearl white, half buried in mud. She pocketed it carefully. Then, as she turned to leave, she noticed something that made her heart beat faster. A loose scrap of cloth snagged on the fence. It was torn roughly from a sleeve. Gray cotton, the same as the half-finished dress on the table. Miss Marple straightened slowly. The thread wasn't just decoration. It was a trail. Someone had tried to cover a seam, and in doing so, had left one uncut, leading directly to the truth. She looked once more at the quiet shop, then back down the lane toward the village green. Somewhere behind those calm windows and pleasant faces, someone was lying. And lies, she knew, were very poor stitching. They always came apart in the end. As she walked home beneath the dripping trees, she murmured softly to herself, everyone in St. Mary Mead is connected by threads. Family, favor, gossip, money. And when one of those threads breaks, well, it pulls the rest with it. She reached her gate, closed it quietly, and paused at her doorstep. A shadow moved near her hedge, quick, silent, gone in an instant. Miss Marple stood perfectly still. The night air pressed against her face. Then she turned, eyes sharp as glass, and looked toward the dark lane behind her house. Someone was watching her, and they knew she was pulling at the wrong thread. Chapter 3. The Pattern Revealed. Morning came sharp and pale, with mist curling over the gardens of St. Mary Mead. The village seemed quieter than usual, as though it sensed something watching from behind its own lace curtains. People spoke in hushed tones, doors closed softly. The gossip had gone from lively to fearful, and at the center of it all stood the empty shop on High Street. Locked again, the red thread still glinting faintly through the window like a wound that would not close. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual. She moved through her cottage with quiet purpose, gathering her thoughts as she made tea. There was something she could feel just out of reach, a small piece of truth that refused to fit the rest of the pattern. By 8:30, Inspector Graves was at her door once more. His boots were muddy, his expression troubled. "We found something, Miss Marple," he said without ceremony, "down by the old mill. A bundle caught in the reeds." Her hand tightened slightly around her teacup. A bundle. He hesitated. A coat. And inside it, a keyring with Mrs. Webb's initials. Miss Marple took a slow breath. No sign of her. None yet. "We'll keep searching. The river bends there. Things get caught." She nodded gently. "I see. The river always gives back what it takes, Inspector. Sometimes too late, but it does." He frowned slightly. "You don't seem surprised." Miss Marple's eyes lifted to his, calm and steady. "I've seen a good deal of life, Inspector. People rarely vanish cleanly. It's the small marks, the bits that cling, that tell you the truth." Later that morning, Miss Marple paid a call on Lydia Reeves again. The young woman looked drawn, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. She opened the door of her small rented flat and stepped aside without speaking. Miss Marple noticed at once that the gray dress, the one Agnes Webb had been altering, was hanging on a chair. The hem had been finished. The thread was red. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "may I ask who finished your dress?" Lydia froze. I did. After she disappeared. I thought, well, it was almost done and—" "You used the same red thread?" Miss Marple asked softly. Lydia's voice faltered. "Yes. It was the only spool left in her shop." Miss Marple looked at it closely. The stitches were uneven, rushed. But more curious was a small dark spot near the edge of the fabric, faint like dried rust. "She prick her finger?" Lydia asked uncertainly, seeing Miss Marple's gaze. "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. "Or perhaps not." Lydia sank into her chair. "Do you think she's really gone?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. "I think Mrs. Webb had something she should not have had, something that belonged to someone else. And when she realized what it meant, she was frightened." "What could she possibly have had?" Lydia asked, trembling. "Not a thing of value," Miss Marple said quietly, "but something that proved value or guilt. Tell me, my dear, this friend who gave you the dress, was he generous in other ways?" Lydia's face went pale. "He's married," she whispered. "He said he'd leave her, but—" "I see," Miss Marple said softly, her tone kind, not judgmental. "And Mrs. Webb found out?" "I think so. She saw the name on the label. I tore it out, but she'd already read it." "And whose name was it?" Lydia hesitated, eyes glistening. "Edward Finchley, the solicitor." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Ah, yes, his office on the green. And he does Mrs. Webb's accounts, does he not?" Lydia nodded faintly. Miss Marple rose. "Thank you, my dear. You've been very brave." When she reached the solicitor's office later that afternoon, the sky had darkened again, heavy with clouds. Edward Finchley was alone inside, sorting papers. A well-kept man in his 40s, with a smooth voice and a polished smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said pleasantly. "What a surprise." "I'm sorry to intrude, Mr. Finchley," she said, setting her umbrella aside. "I simply wish to ask a small favor, a matter of village concern." "Of course," he said easily. "Anything for you." Miss Marple smiled politely. "You handled Mrs. Webb's affairs, did you not?" He blinked once, too slowly. "Yes, yes. Small accounts. Nothing of consequence." "I imagine she trusted you," Miss Marple said gently, "as most people do their solicitor." "Quite right." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the framed certificate behind him, then back to his face. "And she came to see you recently, did she not? The day before she vanished." For a fraction of a second, his expression flickered. "I believe she might have. I see many clients, Miss Marple." "Of course," she said. "And perhaps she mentioned a letter? Something she was preparing to post." Finchley's hand stilled on the desk. "I really couldn't say." Miss Marple's voice remained light, almost airy. "You see, Inspector Graves told me they found no letter among her things. I wondered if it might have been misplaced here. Letters do tend to wander when they hold uncomfortable truths." He gave a small, tense laugh. "You have quite an imagination, Miss Marple." "Oh, not at all," she said, standing. "Imagination implies invention. I prefer observation." She gathered her gloves, then paused. "One last question, Mr. Finchley. You knew Lydia Reeves?" He looked up sharply. "I beg your pardon?" "She speaks very fondly of you." His jaw tightened. "I have professional dealings with many residents." "I'm sure you do," she said, smiling. "Good day, Mr. Finchley." Outside, the rain had begun again, thin, cold, relentless. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the churchyard, thinking. A solicitor tied to a vanished seamstress. A young woman tied to a secret affair. A thread of red, out of place, running through it all. And somewhere in that line of connection lay the truth, the part of the fabric no one wanted seen. She stopped by the gate to the old mill road. The reeds rustled softly in the breeze. And there, half buried in the mud, something glinted faintly. She crouched and brushed it aside with a gloved hand. It was a thimble, silver, engraved with initials, A.W. She turned it over, frowning. Inside, pressed into the metal, was something sticky and dark. She knew at once what it was. Blood. She straightened, her breath steady. "Oh, Agnes," she whispered. "You fought, didn't you?" A sound behind her made her turn, a soft crunch of gravel. A figure stood at the edge of the road, half shadowed by the trees. It was Edward Finchley. "Out for a walk, Miss Marple," he said with forced lightness. She smiled faintly. "The air does one good. And you, Mr. Finchley? Not often one finds a solicitor at the river." "I could ask the same," he said. "True," she replied. "But my reasons are quite innocent." He took a step closer. "You shouldn't meddle, Miss Marple. Sometimes curiosity can turn dangerous." She met his gaze calmly. "Oh, I've lived long enough to know that danger is merely another name for poor planning. I'm quite safe." He studied her for a moment, his jaw tightening. Then he smiled again, thinly. "You take care now." And he walked away. Miss Marple stood in silence until the sound of his footsteps faded. Then she looked down once more at the thimble in her palm. The initials glinted even in the dim light. She tucked it carefully into her handkerchief and turned toward home. That night, she wrote a letter of her own to Inspector Graves. "Dear Inspector," there's a reason the thread was red. It was not for decoration, but for memory. Mrs. Webb discovered something stitched into a dress that was not hers to keep, a secret sewn into the very fabric. I believe the missing letter and the thread are connected. I suggest a search of the solicitor's office, particularly his waste bin and the lock drawer on the left-hand side of his desk. Yours faithfully, Miss Marple. She sealed the letter, set it beside the lamp, and sat back. The cottage was silent except for the ticking clock and the faint wind outside. She thought again of Agnes Webb's tidy shop, the red thread curling like a signal through the stillness, and the small stain near the rug. Not enough for panic, but enough for truth. There were lies in St. Mary Mead, woven tight as linen. But Miss Marple had begun to see the pattern. A woman's conscience, a man's vanity, a letter meant to expose them both, all caught in a single uncut thread. And tomorrow, she knew, the truth would come loose completely. Chapter 4. The Thread Tightens. Morning broke with a low hum across St. Mary Mead, the kind of hush that falls before something inevitable happens. The sky was gray, the streets empty. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting quietly as she waited for the sound she knew would come. It came at 9:30, a sharp knock at the door. Inspector Graves stood outside, rain on his hat, fatigue in his eyes. "You were right, Miss Marple," he said grimly. "We searched the office." "And?" she asked softly. He stepped inside and handed her a sealed evidence bag. Inside it was a torn letter, smudged but legible enough to read. "I cannot let this go on. Lydia deserves to know the truth. If you do not tell her yourself, I will." The signature was unmistakable. Agnes Webb. Miss Marple sighed. "And where was it found?" "In the waste bin," Graves said. "He must have tore it up in a hurry." She nodded slowly. "And the missing spool of red thread?" "In his desk drawer. Same as the one from her shop." Graves leaned against the mantel, rubbing his temples. "We found blood traces under the carpet in his office, too. He claims it's from a cut finger, but the lab will tell us otherwise." Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost tender. "He confronted her, didn't he?" She knew about his affair, and she meant to tell the young woman. For all her faults, Mrs. Webb was a moral soul. She could not stand deceit. Graves gave a small nod. "You've got a knack for this, Miss Marple. But what I don't understand is, why the red thread?" She smiled faintly. "Because she tried to mend what he'd torn. Agnes always said a loose end should be tied up properly. She must have used that red thread to hem the truth into something solid, perhaps into the dress itself. A clever seamstress hides her secrets where no one thinks to look." Graves frowned. "You mean—" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "in the hem of Lydia Reeves's dress." They arrived at Lydia's flat within the hour. The young woman stood pale and trembling in the doorway as Graves explained the situation. She let them in without a word. Miss Marple's eyes went straight to the gray dress folded neatly on the chair. "My dear," she said gently, "may I see the hem?" Lydia hesitated, then handed it over. Miss Marple took out a small pair of embroidery scissors from her handbag, old but sharp. With a careful snip, she opened the seam. Inside, rolled tightly within the fold, was a small piece of paper. Graves unfolded it with gloved hands. It was a receipt from the solicitor's office, dated the day before Agnes disappeared, signed by Edward Finchley himself, acknowledging the withdrawal of a large sum in cash. She found out he was moving money illegally, Miss Marple said softly. She must have taken this as proof, meaning to show it to the authorities. But she never had the chance. Lydia covered her mouth, tears welling. He said she'd gone away for a while, that she was tired. I believed him. Miss Marple reached out and touched her hand gently. "Men who lie often sound very convincing, my dear. It's how they've survived this long." Graves folded the receipt carefully. "We'll take this to the station. It's enough to hold him, and enough for a search warrant on his property." He turned to Miss Marple. "You've done it again. I don't know how you keep doing it." She smiled faintly. "Patterns, Inspector. People are rather like cloth. Weave them long enough, and their true pattern always appears." That afternoon, word spread through the village like wine through the hedges. The solicitor had been arrested. Evidence had been found at his house. The missing ledger, blood-stained gloves, and a buried bag near the old mill. The river had taken Mrs. Webb's body for a time, but it had returned her, as Miss Marple had said it would. Justice, in its quiet way, had come full circle. Miss Marple walked to the shop on High Street one last time. The lock had been replaced, the shelves empty. She stepped inside, dust motes swirling in the sunlight. The smell of fabric and lavender lingered faintly, as though Agnes herself still moved somewhere between the aisles. She ran a hand along the counter. There, tucked in the corner, was a single spool of red thread, forgotten or perhaps waiting. She picked it up and smiled sadly. "You left it uncut, didn't you, Agnes?" So someone would see. Outside, the rain had stopped. The cobblestones gleamed under the clearing sky. Miss Marple walked slowly home, her umbrella folded at her side, her eyes thoughtful. The village had returned to its calm rhythm, though she knew whispers would fill the tea tables again by morning. They always did. St. Mary Mead lived on stories, quiet lives hiding unspoken truths. But she also knew that beneath all the gossip, people here believed in something deeply simple. That in the end, truth matters, and that no secret stays buried forever. That evening, as the clock struck 7, Miss Marple sat once more by her window. Her knitting needles clicked softly, silver in the lamplight. Outside, children laughed somewhere down the lane, and a church bell rang faintly in the distance. She smiled to herself. "One more pattern finished," she murmured. Then, after a small pause, "and one more thread tied off." The clock ticked on, steady and peaceful. In the quiet of her little cottage, Miss Marple returned to her tea, the red thread resting on her table like a promise that every mystery, no matter how tangled, could be unraveled by patience, kindness, and the simplest of eyes. If you enjoyed watching Miss Marple unravel this mystery, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who loves classic detective stories, and subscribe for more mysteries from the quiet corners of England, where every shadow hides a secret. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your thread uncut.